Just realized I don't have my vest on, and I feel strange. Mayhem Campaign Diary number 8. I think I'll call this one Alder von Yggdrasil, which you will see in a moment why. This is another session that I think the diary of it might end up becoming rather short, so we'll see if I tie it into the next week's episode, or if I just make it its own. It's been 2 weeks since we played last. 1 week I just wasn't feeling well, and then the next week, at least 2 of our players couldn't make it, so we called it off then too. We were able to make this one, even though we had to stop a little earlier than we normally would have. Picking up where we left off last, in the after the phase spider had just been killed, they moved into the room where the phase spider had been after completing their long rest just to inspect it. Suri wandered off ahead and managed to get caught in the phase spider's webs. Though they were able to cut her out and everything was fine, then they chose to burn them away. And after inspecting the room the phase spider had been in, it was mainly just kind of like a relay point for the different arcane energies that were powering different rooms or devices, or probably even the tower above in some ways. And a bunch of the pipes and machines were damaged or broken, so there wasn't much that they could do with it, and they realized that there wasn't anything of too much importance there. From this point on, Tristan decided that he would be in charge of scouting, and because of that he decided to cast invisibility on himself and then use his own abilities as a fairy or a sprite in this case, using the fairy race. The Unearthed Arcana one, because I just like that better than what was officially released, and used his abilities to slide in underneath doorways. The next door that they went to would have been about 9 o'clock on the map that we were using. Was full of wooden automatons, and Tristan threw a rock at the other side of the room in order to see if any of them reacted. Only one did, and when it didn't see anything actually there making the noise, it just went back to its place. Tristan then just returned to everyone else and told them what he saw, decided that maybe they should just check out that room again later, in case that they would have to fight whatever was in it. The next room that they entered appeared to be an old storage room. Most of the shelves had been rotted away, most of the materials in there were destroyed. Tristan managed to find an old bracelet. I think I described it as being well crafted, and just pocketed it quickly because she didn't want Suri to find it and try and steal it right away. This room, originally in the adventure that I'm using for this, was supposed to contain a mephit, I think. That was it, a mephit that I don't even remember whose. It was someone's familiar, I don't even remember whose, but I decided to remove that just because it seemed out of place. If we hadn't been on such a tight schedule, I probably would have replaced it with some kind of fey creature that they could talk to, but I just decided to just leave it be and just leave the bracelet in there. Whenever they decide to examine the bracelet, see how much it's worth, and they can learn more about it, that would have been an option tonight, but it didn't happen. And the final pathway they went down led to another room where a bunch of the arcane machinery this time was overgrown with various plants and whatnot. Tristan was not able to identify what any of the plants were, and called everyone else in. One of the plants had actually sprayed spores at Tristan, but it didn't hurt him or anything, and so he didn't know what it was and wasn't able to identify it himself, so he had Suri try. Suri snuck in stealthily and examined the plants and was able to identify them as I think it's called yellow creepers. And this is a plant that basically the spores will charm you and convince you to move closer to the plant, where it will basically kill you and then turn you into a zombie to propagate itself. Very creepy, very cool, I think. They decided to avoid these. There was a chest in the corner that they opened. It contained a wand, a scroll, and 2 potions. They don't have identify, so they don't really know what any of these are. I need to check and see if there's a rule for identifying potions that I'm pretty sure there is, or I might be mistaking it for what it was in Pathfinder. But if there isn't, then I'll have to make one. Because it used to be maybe make an Arcana check and you just sample it or something like that. Testing out the wand, though it did take a few minutes before Tristan decided to do that, and he went off into a room by himself, so safety first. And I described it as he was quite certain that there was no poisons or disease within 30 feet of him. To which Garion chimed in and was like, "Oh yes, there's no syphilis here." I don't know if Mary herself identified that the spell was detect poisons and disease, basically. I think it's a druid spell. I don't know if clerics get it or not. They should, it would make sense. And while all of this was going on, it was then Suri actually snuck off away from the party and went back to the Barrow Hound, where she decided that she just wanted to play with it, I guess, and she even drew him a picture. I had her make a performance check. It was a fairly decent picture, and the Barrow Hound liked it. And because of that, he liked her. I described that he licked her. And it was at that time that Tristan realized that Suri was gone and started calling for Suri, which I think it started worrying them more, because when he was calling for Suri, then you had Suri's player Miss actually laughing. She was laughing because I just told her in a DM that the Barrow Hound just decided to lick her, basically. And after a few minutes of this going on, Tristan decided, French accent, if I know Suri, she's with the dog. And then they went to the Barrow Hound and found her. It had picked her up and was like carrying her around by her head and gone back into the trees, basically. And then when they came into the room, it brought her back out. It was after this that they returned to the 9 o'clock room and opened it and entered. And once again, only the single automaton, the wooden automaton, responded to them. I believe it was Azrael who went in first, because their plan was basically that if a fight broke out, they were going to have the ones who could use fire magic be up there to torch it. And when it saw them, when it heard them, really, its response, it asked if they were Master Tessarael. They attempted to lie, and they had no way of knowing that. I didn't even have them roll a deception check because there was just no way that they could succeed, because this thing wasn't automated, at least not anymore, and it knew who Tessarael was, and it knew that Tessarael was a woman and not a tiefling. Azrael was able to write it off as having misheard him, thinking that he said Azrael, and this is when they began their dialogue with him. They thought that all of these golems were guarding something, but in reality, then they did manage to figure out that this was basically just a storage room, and that these golems had built the tower and were just placed in here and were just told to wait until they received further orders, and that's what they were doing. When they asked the golem its name, he just said he was number 1, and that he didn't have a name, all he had was a number. And that kind of got the reaction I kind of wanted out of them, and like some of them were just like, oh, that's kind of sad, because he was clearly sentient, and even he knew that he was. When they started asking him like if there was anything that he wanted to do, and how did I put it? I kind of had him speaking in a slow and kind of broken tone. Because I wanted it to kind of feel like he was, whatever was powering him wasn't fully there, basically. And I think he told them that when they asked him like what he wanted to do, he just said, I'm programmed to wait. And when they asked him, it was like, well, what would you do if those orders couldn't be followed, or if the person who gave you those orders is gone? And he just said, well, I'm programmed to wait. Or no, it wasn't programmed to wait, it was I'm ordered to wait. I had them all make a wisdom check, everyone but Gideon and Tristan succeeded. And with their wisdom check, I equated it to a quote that is often linked to Harriet Tubman, I believe, which was something along the lines of, I freed 1,000 slaves and I'd have freed many more if only they knew they were slaves. So I use that to explain to them that this construct, the idea of like choosing for itself, it wasn't a concept that it was familiar with. So even though it knows it's sentient, even though you know it's sentient, what you're talking about it has no clue about. As far as they can tell, he was basically created, built this place, and then put in a storage closet. He doesn't have any concept or even experience thinking for himself. And after a few moments of discussion, they were actually able to convince him that he should make a decision for himself. And he decided that he was going to go with them. These were the only people we had basically met since his master, and he didn't know where to go, so he would just follow them. It was Azrael who suggested that if he was going to follow them, that he would need a name, that number 1 was not going to suffice. Number 1, as he was currently called, had no idea what he would even call himself, so I suggested to them, that because they all started making suggestions, I said, well, anyone who wants to throw a name forward will pick one. And then I had everyone make a persuasion check, and that would be the name that number 1 would go with. See, I think Garion threw out like Chester or something. Suri wanted Martin. and eventually who won, Azrael. He was tied up between Alder, which is a type of tree, I guess, I'm unfamiliar with, or Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. And just as a joke, I said Alder von Yggdrasil, and then everyone seemed to like that. They thought it was pretty cool, so that is now what his name is, Alder von Yggdrasil. And he will be following them. I don't entirely know what I will do with this character, or how much he will follow them around, or even if I'm going to need to adjust the stat block I have for him, because it might be a little too powerful to be following them around, or I might keep the same just for the hell of it, who knows. Or maybe this wood golem, as he is been originally programmed when he was created to not harm people or something, so maybe he won't fight with them, who knows. I really got to decide that. Next session is when they are going to the Planner Portal, and that's when they're going to be sending the Barrowhound and the fish, that I cannot remember exactly what it was called, back to the Feywild. And it is somewhat suggested that Tristan might try to convince everyone to go to the Feywild as well. So I'm going to need to read up on the Feywild now, and just in case that happens, so I know what I can do there. It will be very interesting, to say the least. I've got a few ideas that could make things very interesting. I even have one idea of what I can do for when they actually do open the portal. I might have another character that I can introduce them to. That remains to be seen, though. So I guess we'll find out what happens hopefully next week, and may all your 20s be natural, and have a good night.